This PowerPoint is the research that I conducted in order to create effective interventions for my case study student. Since my case study student goes to Roberts Academy, I knew that she was dyslexic, and so the first thing that I wanted to research was dyslexia. Simply, dyslexia is a collection of characteristics that vary based on the individual. It's known as a specific learning disability, and around 4% of the population are affected. Usually, dyslexia can be seen in children who are having issues with spelling or word reading fluency. Here's a graphic I found when I was conducting my research. It shows how dyslexia affects different parts of an individual, such as memory difficulties. It even has an effect on motor control, reading, spelling, listening, writing, and even spatial and temporal. So people with dyslexia could have difficulties with telling time. They could even have coordination problems or difficulty hearing sounds. Some characteristics of dyslexia include lacking long-term or short-term memory, the inability to phonologically process letters, words, or phrases, even having visual processing difficulties or issues with multitasking. So asking a student to read and write down things at the same time could be quite difficult if they have dyslexia. Dyslexia has a major impact on literacy development because it leads to oral reading errors, difficulty developing phonics skills, and difficulty with reading comprehension. There's also problems with fluent reading, specifically with accuracy, and people with dyslexia often confuse small words and have spelling issues and speech problems. So you can see how it affects a lot of different literacy and reading components and how that makes a big impact. Moving on, the first unique impeding factor that I researched was phonics. So basically, phonics involves the ability of correlating sounds with the letters and words that represent them. I noticed that this was an issue when I tested my case study for word reading efficiency. I used the Tower 2 assessment, where basically she just had to read certain words to me, and it helped me see how she was phonemic decoding and sight word efficiency, where she stood with those. So her scores actually indicated that she fell a whole year behind, and she was below average at phonemic decoding and sight word efficiency. So moving forward, this indicated to me that I should practice extra word reading with her. Also, when I conducted an elementary spelling inventory, she scored within the middle and late periods of the within word pattern stage. And these scores were able to tell me that she needed more specific practice with vowel teams, inflected endings, and sight words. So here you can see the elementary spelling inventory that I conducted. On the left is what I read from, and on the right are the words that she wrote. So I want to direct your attention to starting around number 12. She starts to really struggle with the vowel teams and just phonetically spelling out those words. So that's just what indicated to me that phonics would be a good strategy to work on with her. So how does phonics impact literacy development? Phonics is essentially the foundation of reading, so students must learn to match letters to sounds and vice versa in order to begin to understand the reading process. In the Multiple Paths to Literacy book, I found this quote that I really thought summed up phonics. It says that word analysis and word identification influence a reader's ability to understand what is read in a passage or sentence, which influences the ability to decode other unknown words. So basically, explicit phonics instruction is important because students need to learn how to segment and blend phonemes to sound out words. And with a firm foundation in phonics, students that will struggle with learning to read and advancing in their literacy development. Reading plays a big role in every different subject. So if a student is caught up on how to pronounce certain words or how to sound out these words so that they can recognize them, they're going to fall behind in other areas of their studies. And students struggling with phonics will often misspell, misread, and mispronounce. So my second impeding factor is vocabulary development. With my case study student, I noticed my student struggle with vocabulary when I was conducting an informal reading inventory. The student just had to read a book, or not a book, but a small story to me, and I was able to score how she read that. And to begin the informal reading inventory, I asked my student clear concept questions that should be able to activate background knowledge, and she gave me very basic responses, if any at all. And that made it clear to me that the student was having a hard time relating a word to a concept as a whole. So here you can see scoring for this informal reading inventory, and you can see on the upper left-hand corner the concept questions and how her answers were very sparse. So how does this impact literacy development? Another quote that I really enjoyed from the text was, "There's a reciprocal relationship between knowledge of word meanings and comprehension. As one grows, it enhances the other, and the result is a cycle of growth in both areas." So students with a small understanding of vocabulary often suffer with reading as a whole. They need to be able to comprehend. Just like with phonics, they need to be able to sound out the words. With the vocabulary, they have to comprehend what they're reading. And in order to do that, they need to understand the words that they're reading. And students need to be exposed to vocabulary words consistently so that they can develop an understanding and appreciation for word awareness. It's important that students are able to develop word learning strategies because they are helpful and useful in all aspects of literacy learning. The third impeding factor that I researched was oral language development. Oral language acts as a gateway to other forms of literacy development. So how I noticed this was a issue that my student was struggling with was when I observed her struggle to express herself both academically and socially to her peers. I saw her using her hands a lot to illustrate a point instead of being able to say to a peer what was bothering her. Also, the results I collected from my informal reading inventory showed that my student was unable to communicate answers or thoughts fluidly, and you can really see how oral language and vocabulary really play a role with each other. When I was researching, I found this graphic. It just shows the different aspects of oral language. Mainly, oral language involves communication, so it's really clear that students have an issue communicating because if they struggle with oral language, they aren't able to explain themselves or orally recount or even give and follow directions. So how does it impact literacy development? It consists of multiple aspects of literacy, including phonics, grammar, vocabulary, and structure. It's the development is basically a foundation for writing because it's when the children really discover how to communicate effectively. And children rely on their oral language to guide their interaction with many other aspects of literacy. And students who express themselves less or who don't participate in discussion often fall behind their classmates in spelling, grammar, and reading comprehension. Cooperation is so important to engage learning, and a student who's not as comfortable with oral language will often not cooperate or collaborate because they tend to avoid discussion with their peers. Next, I'm going to talk about the different stages of language acquisition. So the first stage would be primary. So children in this primary stage of language acquisition are able to use possessive words such as he, she, and we. They can sometimes express ideas or feelings and can describe the use of some objects that they're really familiar with, such as a fork or a car. They tend to understand that a sister is a girl or brother is a boy, and they enjoy rhymes because that's what they're exposed to quite a bit. They ask a lot of questions, especially what, where questions, but they don't have really any sense of grammar. And they sometimes are able to use comparative adjectives, but their word count is low. It's between 1,500 and 2,500 words. At the intermediate stage, students use comparative words such as better, worse, or best, and they can usually understand past, present, and future tense and usually use passive voice. They can kind of tell, develop narratives or stories, and speak compound and complex sentences, so they're beginning to expand the way that they speak. They tend to use pronouns correctly in plural language, and they understand prefixes and suffixes, and their word count is over 2,800 words. In the middle and high school stage of language acquisition, students are familiar with academic language, and they can actually debate concepts and present positive and negative viewpoints on certain concepts. So with that debate, they're able to kind of articulate their own opinions. They recognize tone of voice and inflection, and they're able to articulate and pronounce vocabulary words clearly. They're familiar with abstract vocabulary and concepts. And here is a language acquisition quote from Noam Chomsky that just really shows that language acquisition is a very important, essential part of being a human being. You can't really teach language, but rather you should be exposed to it. So, how does language acquisition relate to literacy development? It's essential for both cognitive and social development. It's basically how students construct knowledge and how they're able to form meaningful relationships. This kind of goes back to oral language and the ability to communicate. Children need language acquisition support from an early age to be able to advance their learning. It's so important that they're exposed to it, that they're talked to a lot. And it serves as an indicator for long term academic success. Next are the cognitive acquisition stages. So the first stage is primary. In a primary stage of cognitive acquisition, a child is normally able to identify primary colors. They can usually count to 10 and have a fair sense of time. They can understand the difference between day and night activities, which helps them understand routines. They usually do fantasy play, and they can draw somewhat recognizable pictures, but they also spend a lot of time tracing. In the intermediate stage, the child's normally able to count up to 100. They can recognize different shapes and numbers, and at the same time, they can arrange things in order by size, from smallest to largest or largest to smallest. They can understand commands and right and wrong actions and what are their rules and how to follow them. They're able to create their own plan to meet a goal, and they know their own address or phone number. They often have that memorized. They can understand the idea of a joke, so they can kind of get a little bit of tone of voice. They can tell time, and they know general months that holidays fall. In the middle and high school, they can obviously express their own opinions. It goes back to language acquisition when they're able to debate. They can retain a higher level of content and take ownership of their own studies, so they don't need to be reminded of things. They know what is required of them to be successful, and they honestly have their own beliefs. So, how does cognitive acquisition play into literacy development? Information process is an important part of learning to read. So, attention is key in learning to read and developing fluency. Another cognitive acquisition piece is working memory. That's important for information processing and ultimately literacy development. But beyond that, just being able to tell time and sense of day and routines and rules helps children understand what's going on inside of the text that they're reading. Next are the stages of reading acquisition. So, primary reading acquisition, children are able to identify a few letters of the alphabet, and they often know how to print their own name because they're familiar with those specific letters. They can recognize words commonly found in the environment, such as stop from stop signs, and they have some knowledge about books, so they can kind of get print concepts, such as like reading from left to right and the covers and spines of books. And they are beginning to develop phonological reading skills and being able to blend sounds. In the intermediate stage, the average words per minute that children read would be 23 to 127. So they're beginning to develop automatosity when reading text they are familiar with, so they can automatically read certain words. They are developing fluency and the ability to decode words, which goes along with that, and they begin to read or learn or gain information. Instead of just reading to sound out the words, they are actually reading for meaning. So at the same time, they understand importance of word meaning and vocabulary. In the middle and high school stages, the average words per minute that a child is able to read would be between 136 and 450, which is a really broad range. They can read and understand material from multiple viewpoints, so you could give them two sources and have them compare and contrast those things with their critical thinking skills. They're also beginning to understand domain-specific vocabulary and develop their own viewpoints and opinions on the readings. So, how does reading acquisition influence literacy development? Well, to be fully literate, one must be able to read with accuracy. And reading comprehension enables students to understand classroom content in all different subjects. Reading skills and tactics are utilized in all aspects of education and grade levels. Students are always going to have to be able to read, so reading acquisition is extremely important, especially when relating it to literacy development. And the more students read, the more literate come. So, what have I learned from all of this research? In order for children to become fully literate, they must have opportunities to acquire effective cognitive, reading, and language development. I learned that phonics is an essential foundation for vocabulary development, and oral language is a big part of literacy as it involves effective communication. Doing this research also helped me learn how to provide successful interventions for my student. These interventions will be based upon my research, so they're going to be informed and scientific. So after researching 3 of the impeding factors that affect my student, I have a better understanding of how these factors affect her everyday learning process. So I can kind of step into my student's shoes, which I think is really important as a teacher to be able to do and see from her perspective where she's struggling, what is frustrating her, and why. This research helped me choose the factor that I want to focus on and gave me ideas for how to begin interventions. I'm going to do oral language and a little bit of vocabulary development, but mainly focus on oral language with my case study student because I find that communication is such an important piece in developing not only reading fluency, but also along with writing. So, how does this relate to my teaching philosophy and my plans as a future teacher? I understand the importance of completely assessing my student to determine their reading levels and learning levels and any possible help or accommodations that they may need. At the same time, I understand that after assessing and using those results, I should go and research so that I know how to best intervene and provide interventions for my student. I understand how phonics, oral language, and vocabulary development affect literacy as a whole, and it's important that each one of my students feel comfortable in this area in order for them to feel as if they are successful within the classroom and beyond.